My name is Reese and I am 33 years old. Days before my 23rd birthday, I knew my sister would manufacture a crisis to ruin the evening. It had become a pattern I could not ignore anymore. So when my parents abandoned me at an expensive steakhouse to rescue her from a completely fabricated emergency, I made a choice. I left them for good. 10 years later, they found themselves sitting in my boardroom, begging for a $4 million bailout. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the scapegoat in your family and had to walk away to find your own success. The restaurant was dimly lit with crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over white tablecloths. It was supposed to be a rare celebration just for me. For weeks, my mother Linda and my father Thomas had promised that this dinner would be different. They promised that my older sister Chelsea, who was 25 at the time, would not hijack the evening. Chelsea had conveniently opted out of dinner, claiming she was exhausted from work. I should have known better than to believe the peace would last. The waiter had just cleared our dinner plates and asked if we were ready for dessert. I nodded, feeling a rare spark of happiness. We had enjoyed premium steaks, expensive appetizers, and a bottle of wine that my father had insisted on getting to celebrate my new job. But before the waiter could even bring out the cake, my mother's phone began to ring loudly, shattering the quiet atmosphere of the dining room. She looked at the screen and gasped. It was Chelsea. My mother answered immediately and put the call on speakerphone right there at the table. Chelsea was sobbing hysterically. Her voice echoed loudly, drawing stares from the tables around us. She claimed she had been robbed at a luxury ski resort 3 hours away. She said her purse was gone, her car keys were missing, and she was stranded in the freezing cold lobby with absolutely nothing. My mother instantly went into a panic. She started gathering her purse and knocking over her water glass in the process. My father stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He immediately grabbed his heavy winter coat and started putting it on. They were leaving. Right then and there, leaving my 23rd birthday dinner to go rescue the golden child. I sat frozen in my seat for a moment. Then my brain caught up with the situation. Something about Chelsea's story made absolutely no sense. I pulled out my phone and opened the family tracking application that my father had insisted we all install for safety. I zoomed in on Chelsea's location. Her phone signal was not coming from the ski resort lobby. It was pinging directly from the resort main bar and lounge area. I did not stop there. Because Chelsea and I shared a joint emergency credit card account from our college days, I logged into the banking application. I wanted to see if her cards were truly stolen. Right there on the screen, a pending transaction for a massive hotel bill had just been declined due to insufficient funds. 5 minutes later, there was a new approved transaction for 2 expensive cocktails at the resort bar. She had not been robbed. She had maxed out her credit cards on a luxury vacation she could not afford, and she needed our parents to drive 3 hours to pay her hotel bill and bail her out. I held my phone across the table, showing the glowing screen to my parents. I kept my voice low, trying to maintain some dignity, while the other diners watched our table with morbid curiosity. "Mom, look at the screen," I urged her. "Chelsea is not stranded in the freezing cold. She is sitting in the heated bar drinking a $20 cocktail. Her credit card was just declined for her room charge. She made up the robbery so you would come pay her hotel bill." My mother stopped putting on her coat and stared at the screen. For a split second, I saw the truth register in her eyes. But accepting the truth meant acknowledging that her favorite daughter was a manipulative liar. Instead of getting angry at Chelsea, my mother turned all her rage onto me. Her face flushed red as she pointed a manicured finger across the table. "You are incredibly jealous and heartless, Reese," my mother hissed. "Your sister is traumatized and alone, and you are playing detective on your phone to make her look bad. I cannot believe you would try to sabotage her when she needs us the most. You have always been jealous of her social life." I stared at her in complete disbelief. "I am not making her look bad," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed anger. "The bank records do not lie. The GPS does not lie. She does this every single time I have a milestone. When I graduated from high school, she faked a panic attack so you would leave the ceremony early. When I got my first real job, she claimed she broke her ankle and it turned out to be a mild sprain. And now on my birthday, she is faking a robbery. My father slammed his hand down on the table, making the silverware rattle. That is enough, Reese, he commanded loudly. We are not going to sit here and listen to you assassinate your sister character while she is in danger. She needs us. We are going to get her. At that exact moment, the waiter approached our table carrying a beautiful chocolate cake with glowing candles. He took one look at my parents putting on their coats and hesitated, unsure of what to do. The cheerful birthday music playing softly overhead felt like a cruel joke. The waiter carefully set the cake down in front of me. "Happy birthday, miss," he whispered awkwardly, quickly retreating to avoid the family drama. My parents did not even look at the cake. They did not wish me a happy birthday. My father signaled for the waiter and asked for the check immediately. The waiter returned with the black leather folder and placed it on the table. My father opened it and glanced at the total. The bill was exactly $300. Instead of pulling out his credit card to pay for the dinner he had invited me to, my father reached into his wallet. He pulled out a single $50 bill and tossed it casually onto the exact center of the table. It landed right next to my melting birthday cake. "You can figure out the rest," my father said, buttoning his coat. "You have a job now. It is time you learned some real responsibility. Figure it out and stop making your sister trauma all about your birthday. The world does not revolve around you, Reese." I looked at the $50 bill, then up at my parents. "You are leaving me with a $300 bill for a dinner you invited me to?" I asked. My voice sounded hollow, stripped of all emotion. I barely had enough money in my checking account to cover my rent for the month. They knew I was struggling financially, working an entry-level job and paying off student loans. They knew this dinner was supposed to be their treat to me. "Your sister needs us," my mother said coldly. She grabbed her purse and did not look back. My father followed her out of the restaurant without another word. I sat alone at the table for a long time. The candles on my birthday cake melted down into the chocolate frosting, creating messy pools of wax. The other diners eventually stopped staring and went back to their meals, but I could still feel their pity burning into my skin. That $50 bill sitting on the white tablecloth was the final piece of evidence I needed. It was proof that in my family, my reality would always be secondary to Chelsea fiction. No matter what I achieved, no matter what truth I presented, they would always choose her lies over my existence. I opened my wallet, pulled out my only debit card, and paid the $300 bill. It drained my account down to my last dollar. I did not eat a single bite of the cake. I walked out of the steakhouse into the cold night air. I did not cry. The tears had completely dried up, replaced by a cold, hard clarity that I had never experienced before. I drove back to my small apartment and started packing my bags that very night. I packed my clothes, my books, and the few things that truly belonged to me. I took the spare apartment key my parents had demanded I give them, and I left it on the kitchen counter. I walked out, locked the door, and disappeared. I did not leave a forwarding address. I changed my phone number the next morning. I blocked their social media accounts and severed every single tie that bound me to them. For 10 years, I remained a ghost to my family. I took all the pain, all the rejection, and all the anger from that night at the steakhouse and turned it into absolute relentless drive. I never looked back. Not until 10 years later, when my assistant handed me a pitch deck from a failing lifestyle brand seeking an emergency $4 million buyout. The CEO listed on the file was my sister Chelsea. The morning after I walked away from that steakhouse, I woke up in a freezing studio apartment with exactly $14 to my name. Disappearing was the easy part. Surviving was the ultimate test. I sold my old car, bought a cheap refurbished laptop, and took a job working the overnight shift at a commercial printing facility. While my family was likely enjoying their luxury ski resort vacations and boasting at their country club dinners, I was surviving on instant coffee and sheer spite. Every time my eyes burned from staring at a screen at 3 in the morning, every time I wanted to collapse from exhaustion, I pictured that $50 bill sitting next to my melting birthday cake. I used that memory as fuel. It became the fire that kept me awake. During my breaks at the printing facility, I taught myself how to code. I had noticed a massive inefficiency in how commercial freight and delivery routes were scheduled across the Midwest. The systems were archaic, bleeding money and time, so I started building a software platform to fix it. I spent 3 grueling years coding in complete isolation. I did not date. I did not take weekend trips. I did not buy new clothes. I poured every single ounce of my energy into my platform. When I finally launched the beta version, I was brutally rejected by 42 different investment firms. They looked at a 26-year-old girl with no family backing, no Ivy League degree, and no connections, and they politely showed me the door. But the 43rd investor took a chance. Within 2 years, my software revolutionized regional freight logistics. The company exploded in value. I went from counting quarters at the laundromat to managing a dedicated staff of 200 brilliant engineers. By the time I turned 30, a major global supply chain conglomerate offered to buy my company. The buyout was astronomical. I signed the paperwork, walked away with wealth that rivaled the old money families my parents so desperately tried to impress, and completely reinvented my life. I did not want fame. I did not want my face plastered on the cover of business magazines. I wanted power, quiet, undeniable, and absolute. I took my capital and founded a private venture capital firm called Apex Horizon. I structured it as a shadow holding company, burying my name behind layers of corporate protections and ironclad non-disclosure agreements. In the corporate world, Apex Horizon became known as a ruthless, highly efficient firm that rescued failing businesses or dismantled them for parts. Nobody knew that the sole decision-maker operating behind the curtain was the girl who had once been left to pay her own birthday dinner tab. For a decade, my life was peaceful. I surrounded myself with a brilliant legal team and financial analysts who respected my vision and matched my work ethic. I lived in a stunning penthouse overlooking the city, far away from the toxic noise of my past. I thought I had completely escaped them. I believed that chapter of my life was permanently closed. Then came a rainy Tuesday morning in November. I was sitting in my corner office reviewing quarterly earnings reports. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a panoramic view of the skyline, a stark contrast to the basement apartment I used to inhabit. My executive assistant, Nora, knocked softly on the open glass door. She carried a thick red priority file under her arm. "We have a last-minute emergency pitch request," Nora said, setting the heavy file on my desk. "I know you usually reject these immediate buyout requests, but the financial analytics team flagged this one. They think the underlying real estate assets might be worth the acquisition cost, even if the brand itself is a complete disaster." I leaned back in my leather chair and adjusted my glasses. "What is the company?" "It is a luxury lifestyle and wellness brand called Serenity." Now, Nora explained, "They are asking for a $4 million emergency cash injection. They claim it is for a massive marketing expansion, but our internal review shows they are hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate. If they do not secure funding by the end of the month, they are going into forced bankruptcy. The bank will seize everything." $4 million is a steep ask for a failing wellness brand, I noted, opening the cover of the file. "Who is the founder?" Nora tapped the top page of the executive summary. "She plays up the whole self-made female entrepreneur angle. Her brand is built heavily on family values and ethical wellness. The numbers tell a completely different story, though. She is drowning in debt and scrambling for a lifeline." I flipped past the executive summary to the founder biography page. The air in my office suddenly felt thin. The ambient noise of the city traffic below seemed to vanish entirely. Staring back at me from the glossy, professionally printed page was a face I had not seen in 10 years. The hair was styled differently, the clothes were far more expensive, but the arrogant, self-satisfied smile was exactly the same. The CEO of the sinking company was my older sister, Chelsea. I sat perfectly still, my eyes scanning the text. The biography was a masterpiece of absolute fiction. It detailed how Chelsea had built her wellness empire from the ground up, supported by her loving, tight-knit family. It talked about her dedication to ethical business practices and her commitment to empowering women. There was absolutely no mention of the trail of financial destruction she usually left in her wake. There was no mention of the lies she used to manipulate our parents. Nora noticed my silence. Is there a problem with the file? She asked, her professional tone shifting to genuine concern. We can pass on the meeting. I can have the legal department draft a standard rejection letter right now. I closed the folder, slowly resting my hands flat on top of the red cover. The universe had an incredible sense of humor. For 10 years, I had worked tirelessly to build an impenetrable fortress of success. I had completely detached myself from the chaos of my family. And now the golden child was knocking on my door, completely unaware that the anonymous venture capitalist she was begging for money was the same sister she had thrown away. No, I said, my voice steady and cold. Do not reject it. I want to take this meeting. Nora looked surprised. You want to meet with them personally? Usually you have the junior partners handle these distressed asset pitches. This one requires my personal attention, I replied. I looked out the window, watching the rain streak across the glass. Set up the meeting for this Friday. But do not use our main corporate headquarters. Book the private executive boardroom at the Oakwood Country Club. The Oakwood Country Club was one of the most exclusive venues in the city. It was exactly the kind of place my parents and Chelsea believed they belonged, in a place dripping with old money and elite status. Holding the meeting there would make them feel comfortable, arrogant, and entirely off their guard. It would play perfectly into their assumptions about wealth and class. Should I send them the standard investor disclosure forms with your name on them? Nora asked, making notes on her digital tablet. Absolutely not, I instructed. Issue a standard non-disclosure agreement from Apex Horizon. Keep all communications strictly under the corporate umbrella. Do not let my name appear on a single piece of paperwork. They need to believe they are meeting with an anonymous corporate entity. I want complete anonymity until I walk into that room. Nora nodded, too professional to ask questions about my sudden need for absolute secrecy. I will handle the arrangements immediately. Do you want the legal team present for the pitch? Yes, I said. Bring the entire senior acquisitions team. I want a full financial audit of Serenity Now completed by Thursday night. Dig into every single vendor payment, every travel expense, every tax filing. Leave no stone unturned. If this company is failing, I want to know exactly where every single dollar went. I want to know who she owes, what she spent it on, and how she managed to sink a company in this economy. As Nora left my office to execute my orders, I opened the red file again. I looked at Chelsea's perfectly curated headshot. She wanted $4 million. She was desperate enough to seek out a ruthless venture capital firm known for hostile takeovers. The girl who had once faked a robbery to avoid the consequences of her own actions was now running a company that was financially bleeding to death. I did not need an audit to know that Chelsea had likely mismanaged the funds. I knew her patterns. I knew her entitlement. But I needed the hard proof. I needed the numbers. Numbers, unlike my family, never lied. I picked up my pen and circled the requested $4 million figure on the pitch deck. A slow, quiet smile spread across my face. They had abandoned me for a $300 dinner tab. They had thrown a $50 bill on the table and told me to figure it out. Now they were walking blindly into my territory, begging for $4 million to save their golden child from ruin. The stage was set. The players were moving exactly where I needed them to be. I spent the rest of the week reviewing the financial autopsy of her company, preparing my strategy with surgical precision. I was not the terrified 23-year-old girl crying over a melted birthday cake anymore. I was the CEO of Apex Horizon, and I was going to give my family exactly what they had given me 10 years ago: a harsh, uncompromising reality check. Friday morning arrived crisp and clear, washing away the lingering rain from earlier in the week. The Oakwood Country Club sat at the edge of the city, a sprawling estate of manicured lawns, towering marble columns, and heavy mahogany doors. It was a fortress of exclusivity, requiring astronomical membership fees and generations of social pedigree to even walk through the front gates. I did not have a membership. I simply owned the corporate holding company that owned the land the club sat on. I arrived an hour before the scheduled meeting. My legal team was already upstairs in the executive boardroom setting up the financial projections and ensuring the audiovisual equipment was ready for the presentation. I chose to wait in the main lobby. I wore a tailored charcoal suit. There were no flashy logos, no ostentatious jewelry. It was the epitome of quiet wealth cut from bespoke Italian wool that cost more than my parents' first mortgage. But to the untrained eye, to people who only understood loud luxury and brand names, it looked like a standard corporate uniform. I stood near a massive stone fireplace, holding a simple leather tablet, and watched the heavy glass entrance doors. I controlled my breathing, centering my focus. I was not the terrified girl they abandoned at a steakhouse. I was the architect of their impending reality check. At exactly 9:45, they walked in. My mother Linda entered first. She was draped in a designer trench coat that practically screamed its price tag, holding a handbag covered in interlocking logos. She walked with her chin tilted up, desperate to look like she belonged among the elite, radiating an anxious need for validation. My father Thomas followed close behind her, wearing a suit that was just slightly too tight around the shoulders, trying to project the image of a seasoned, unbothered executive. And then came Chelsea. She wore a bright crimson dress suit, her hair perfectly blown out, carrying a stack of glossy presentation folders against her chest like a shield. But beneath the expensive makeup, she looked exhausted. The dark circles under her eyes betrayed her absolute panic. Her jaw was tight, and she snapped at my father when he accidentally bumped her shoulder while stepping through the heavy glass doors. They approached the mahogany reception desk. I could hear my mother projecting her voice, adopting that artificially sweet tone she always used for service workers. "We are here for the Apex Horizon meeting," she announced loudly, ensuring anyone nearby knew they were dealing with venture capitalists. The receptionist checked her ledger with practiced politeness. She asked them to wait in the lounge area until the executive team was ready to receive them. Chelsea rolled her eyes, muttering something about investors always playing power games to assert dominance. They turned away from the desk and walked directly toward the fireplace where I was standing. I did not move. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the leather tablet. My mother saw me first. She stopped so abruptly that my father collided with her back. The color instantly drained from her face. Her perfectly manicured hand flew to her throat, her designer bag slipping down her forearm. Thomas looked up, irritated by the sudden stop, and then his gaze locked onto mine. For 5 agonizingly long seconds, nobody breathed. The bustling noise of the country club lobby seemed to fade into a dull hum. 10 years of absolute silence hung in the space between us. I had not spoken a single word to them since that night at the steakhouse. I had not sent a text, an email, or a holiday card. I watched a dozen different emotions wash across my mother's face. Shock, confusion, panic, and then almost instantly, a defensive hardening of her features. She recovered her composure with frightening speed, her spine snapping straight as she reverted to the only dynamic she knew how to play. "Reese," my mother said. Her voice was sharp, carrying that familiar note of reprimand, as if I had just spilled juice on a white rug and ruined her afternoon. "What on earth are you doing here?" I maintained my calm, neutral expression. I did not flinch. "Hello, Mom. It has been a while." My father stepped forward, his eyes darting around the lobby as if assessing whether anyone was watching this uncomfortable family reunion. He looked me up and down, taking in my charcoal suit and the tablet in my hand. "You disappeared for a decade," Thomas said, his voice low and tight with manufactured anger. "No phone calls, no letters. Your mother was worried sick. We had no idea where you went, and now you just show up at our country club." I did not point out the blatant lie. I did not mention that they had never once filed a missing persons report or tried to contact any of my old friends to find me. I simply let his baseless accusation hang in the air, watching him sweat under his tight collar. The hypocrisy was astounding, but I refused to let it break my focus. I knew exactly why they were here, and I knew exactly how much money they were about to lose. Chelsea pushed past our parents, her crimson suit practically vibrating with nervous energy. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing as she performed the exact same visual calculation our parents just did. She saw the lack of identifiable designer logos on my clothing. She saw the tablet clutched in my hands. She saw my calm, unbothered stance in the middle of a country club lobby. The panic in her eyes immediately dissolved into a familiar, smug superiority. "Let me guess," Chelsea said, a cruel smirk spreading across her face. "You work here. You are an event coordinator or something. Is that why you are wearing that boring suit?" My mother let out a short, breathy laugh, the tension leaving her shoulders as she accepted Chelsea's narrative without question. "Oh, Reese, are you on the club administrative staff? We are actually here for a very high-level meeting. My company is securing a massive investment," Chelsea boasted, adjusting her designer handbag on her shoulder to ensure the logo was facing outward. "We are meeting with the senior partners of Apex Horizon. It is a multi-million-dollar deal. The real adults are doing business today." I kept my face entirely impassive. The sheer delusion was breathtaking. They were standing inches away from the very person holding their financial execution orders, and their instinct was to immediately put me in my place. They needed me to be beneath them so they could feel tall. Chelsea took a step closer to me, her smirk widening into a full predatory grin. "It is honestly pathetic, Reese. 10 years and you are still just fetching coffee and managing schedules. I guess dropping out of our lives did not magically make you successful. Try not to mess up our catering today. This meeting is actually important, and I need everything to be absolutely perfect. Do not embarrass us in front of the investors." I looked at her crimson suit, then at the glossy folders clutched in her hands. I noted the slight tremor in her fingers. She was projecting confidence, but the underlying terror of a failing CEO was undeniable. My father stepped forward, puffed out his chest, and tried to look commanding. "You heard your sister, Reese. We have an incredibly significant financial presentation to deliver. We do not have time to deal with your usual drama. Go back to whatever desk you work at, and let us handle our business." I nodded slowly, letting a faint, polite smile touch the corners of my mouth. "Of course," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured and professional. "I would not dream of interrupting your big meeting. I will make sure the executive suite is completely ready for your presentation." Chelsea scoffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "Good. Make sure the sparkling water is chilled this time. I hate when the staff forgets the basics." My mother sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "Honestly, Reese, 10 years to reflect on your behavior, and you are still just serving other people. I suppose some things never change. Let us go, Chelsea. We need to focus on the acquisition details." They turned their backs on me, their loud luxury bags bumping against their hips as they strutted toward the elevators, completely blind to the reality of their situation. I watched them go, my thumb running over the edge of my leather tablet. They were so busy looking down on me that they completely failed to realize I owned the floor they were walking on. I waited until the elevator doors closed behind them before I turned and walked toward the private executive staircase. The trap was set. They had willingly walked right into the center of it, blinded by their own arrogance. I took a deep breath and began my ascent to the boardroom. The real meeting was about to begin. I reached the top of the private executive staircase just as the heavy brass elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. My family stepped out into the opulent waiting lounge, located directly outside the main boardroom. They immediately sank into the tufted leather sofas, their eyes darting around the room to take in the original oil paintings, the dark mahogany panels, and the crystal decanters sitting on silver trays. I stood silently near the heavy oak doors of the boardroom, observing them like a hawk watching its prey. Chelsea noticed me standing there and let out an exaggerated, exasperated sigh. She snapped her fingers in my direction, a sharp echoing sound that made my jaw tighten instinctively. "Are you just going to stand there hovering like a creep?" Chelsea demanded loudly. Her voice echoed off the polished wood walls, dripping with arrogant entitlement. "Since you clearly work on this floor, make yourself useful before the actual investors get here. I need an espresso to focus." My mother chimed in, adjusting her expensive coat and crossing her legs. "Yes, Reese, be a dear. The drive over here was terribly stressful, and we cannot afford any distractions today. Chelsea did not even look at me as she rattled off her order. I want a half decaf extra hot oat milk latte, 2 pumps of sugar-free vanilla, and do not burn the milk. I swear the service staff these days has zero attention to detail. She pulled out her phone immediately, ignoring my existence as she scrolled through her emails. I could have ended the charade right then and there. I could have summoned my security detail from the hallway and had them physically removed from the building. I could have revealed my identity and watched the smug color drain from their arrogant faces. But a sudden realization washed over me. By playing the role of the invisible servant, I had the perfect camouflage. People do not guard their darkest secrets around the help. They view service workers as part of the furniture. Right away, I said, my voice smooth and devoid of any emotion. I walked over to the private barista station tucked into the corner of the executive lounge. I began pulling espresso shots and steaming the oat milk, keeping my back turned to my family. The espresso machine hissed and hummed quietly, providing the perfect acoustic cover for me to listen to every single word they said. Just then, the heavy double doors at the end of the hall opened. An older gentleman in a bespoke tweed suit walked past the lounge area. My father Thomas immediately stood up. He smoothed his tie and plastered on a sickeningly eager smile. He had clearly recognized the man from some local business journal or society page. "Excuse me, Richard, isn't it?" my father boomed, stepping directly into the man's path. "Thomas, we met at the charity gala last spring. I wanted to introduce you to my daughter Chelsea. She is the founder and CEO of Serenity Now. We are actually here today to close a massive acquisition deal with Apex Horizon." The older man offered a tight, polite smile, clearly uninterested in the ambush networking attempt. "Congratulations to you both. Good luck with your meeting." He quickly walked away, eager to escape my father's desperate grasp for relevance. My father puffed out his chest, utterly oblivious to the man's blatant dismissal. He turned back to Chelsea and my mother, a look of manic excitement on his face. "Did you see that networking is everything? We are running in the big leagues now, Chelsea. You have to walk into that boardroom today and project absolute dominance. They need to know you are a massive CEO." I poured the steamed milk over the espresso, listening intently as the facade began to crack. Chelsea let out a shaky breath, her confident posture deflating just a fraction. "Dad, I am trying, but you do not understand the pressure I am under. If Apex Horizon actually looks closely at the fourth quarter marketing expenditures, they might ask questions I cannot answer. I am running out of ways to spin the numbers to look like growth." "You will spin them just fine," my mother said, leaning forward and lowering her voice to a harsh whisper. But she did not lower it enough. In her mind, I was just the barista in the corner, entirely insignificant. "Chelsea, we cannot afford a single mistake today. Your father and I put a second mortgage on the house to cover your inventory costs last quarter. The bank is already calling about the missed payments." My hands froze on the espresso cup. A second mortgage. "I know, Mom," Chelsea snapped, her voice rising with sudden genuine panic. "You remind me every single day. Do you think I want to be in this position?" The branding retreat in Aspen cost 3 times what I projected, but I needed the social media content to look successful. Investors want to see a certain lifestyle. "We are not blaming you, sweetheart," my father said quickly, terrified of upsetting his golden child before the pitch. "We believe in your vision. That is why we emptied the retirement accounts to cover your payroll last month. But Linda is right. We are completely out of capital. If Apex Horizon does not write us a check for $4 million today, we lose the house. Everything is riding on this meeting." I stood frozen at the espresso machine, the ceramic cup warming my hands. The sheer magnitude of their financial delusion hit me like a freight train. My parents, the people who had abandoned me at a restaurant because they claimed I was a selfish drain on their resources, had deliberately bankrupted themselves for Chelsea. They had secretly mortgaged their retirement home. They had completely emptied their life savings. They had sacrificed their entire financial future to fund a failing lifestyle brand because they could not bear to admit their golden child was a complete failure. I turned off the espresso machine and wiped down the counter. The pieces of the puzzle fell into perfect, devastating alignment. Chelsea was not just running a bad business. She was actively sinking our parents into insurmountable debt to fund luxury vacations disguised as marketing retreats. And my parents were willingly handing over the rope she was using to hang them. I placed the latte on the small silver tray. I smoothed my charcoal jacket, erasing any trace of shock from my face, and walked back over to the leather sofas. I set the silver tray down on the glass coffee table directly in front of Chelsea. Your half-decaf oat milk latte with 2 pumps of sugar-free vanilla, I said evenly. Chelsea did not even say thank you. She grabbed the cup, took a sip, and immediately scowled. The milk is burnt, she complained loudly, placing the cup back down with a sharp clatter. I specifically asked you not to burn the milk. Is it really that difficult to follow simple instructions? My apologies, I said, my voice perfectly steady. I will strive for absolute perfection in the future. My mother sighed, waving her hand at me dismissively. Just leave us alone now, Reese. We have incredibly important family matters to discuss before the executives arrive. Go stand by the door, or whatever it is you are supposed to do. Do not hover. I took a step back, folding my hands in front of me. I will be right outside if you need anything else, I replied politely. I walked away from the lounge area, leaving them to their desperate, panicked whispers. They were sitting on a ticking time bomb of their own creation, completely unaware that the countdown had already reached 0. My father was sweating through his suit, terrified of losing his home. My mother was clutching her designer bag, desperate to maintain the illusion of immense wealth. And Chelsea was sipping her burnt coffee, preparing to walk into a boardroom and lie to high-powered investors to save her own skin. They had tied their entire existence to a sinking ship, and they had just handed me the controls to the torpedo. I walked down the hall, pulling out my secure mobile device. I sent a rapid, encrypted message to Nora and my lead financial auditor. Pull the property records for my parents' address immediately. Verify a secondary mortgage. Cross-reference the date of that mortgage with Serenity Now vendor payments for a marketing retreat in Aspen. They are using personal real estate debt to fund fraudulent corporate expenses. Bring the undeniable proof to the boardroom. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. The anger I had carried for 10 years vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, surgical precision. I did not need to yell. I did not need to scream or throw a tantrum to get my revenge. They had already done all the destructive work for me. All I had to do was turn on the lights and let them see the wreckage. I walked down the quiet, carpeted hallway leading away from the public lounge. The heavy mahogany doors of the private executive suites loomed ahead. These suites were strictly off-limits to regular club members, reserved entirely for high-net-worth individuals and corporate leaseholders. I reached into my pocket for my keycard. Before my fingers could even touch the plastic, the sharp, rapid clicking of high heels echoed on the hardwood floor behind me. Hey! Stop right there! Chelsea's voice sliced through the quiet corridor. I turned around slowly. My sister marched toward me, her face flushed with a mixture of irritation and sudden paranoia. She had left our parents in the lounge and followed me down the restricted hallway. She stopped 2 feet away, invading my personal space, her eyes narrowing as she looked me up and down. "Where exactly do you think you are going?" Chelsea demanded. Her tone was sharp and venomous. "This area is strictly for executive members. You are club staff. You belong in the kitchen or behind a reception desk. Why are you lurking around the private suites?" I kept my posture completely relaxed. "I am simply attending to my assigned duties for the upcoming Apex Horizon meeting," I said evenly. "I have clearance to be in this corridor." Chelsea let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Clearance? Do not lie to me, Reese. I saw you lingering near the espresso machine while my parents and I were talking. You were moving incredibly slowly. You were eavesdropping on our private conversation, were you not? You were trying to listen to our financial strategies." I maintained absolute eye contact. I heard nothing that was not broadcast loudly in a public lounge. If your financial strategies are highly confidential, perhaps you should not discuss them in an open room where the service staff can hear every word. Her face contorted with pure fury. "You listen to me very carefully," Chelsea hissed, stepping even closer so I could smell the mints on her breath. "I am the CEO of a major lifestyle brand. I am about to close a $4 million acquisition deal with one of the most powerful venture capital firms in the country. If I even suspect that you are spying on my family or trying to interfere with my business, I will walk right down to the club manager and have you fired on the spot. I will make sure you never work in hospitality again. Do you understand me? She jabbed a finger toward my chest, stopping just short of touching my jacket. You have always been a jealous, bitter little girl. Chelsea continued, her voice dripping with toxic superiority. You disappeared for 10 years because you could not handle the fact that I was the successful one. Now you suddenly reappear as a glorified waitress at the exact country club where I am about to make the biggest deal of my life. It is pathetic. If you breathe one word of what you overheard to anyone, I will destroy your sad little career. I looked at her pointing finger, then up at her panicked, angry eyes. She was a cornered animal lashing out at the only person she thought was beneath her. She had absolutely no idea that she was threatening the executioner. I did not raise my voice. I did not break my calm facade. Instead, I offered her a polite, chillingly serene smile. You do not need to worry about me interfering with your presentation, Chelsea. In fact, I am heavily invested in your success today. I want your pitch to be heard exactly as you intended. Chelsea lowered her hand, looking momentarily confused by my lack of submission. Good. See that you stay out of the way. I took a deliberate step toward the executive suite doors. But since you brought it up, I will make you a promise. I will personally make sure the lead investor of Apex Horizon hears exactly how you treat people. I will ensure the CEO knows everything about your character and your business practices. Chelsea threw her head back and let out a loud, genuine bark of laughter. The sound bounced off the mahogany walls. You are going to talk to the CEO of Apex Horizon. Oh, Reese, you really are completely delusional. Do you honestly think a billionaire venture capitalist cares what a coffee girl has to say? Do you think they even look at people like you? You do not exist to them. You are invisible. I smiled wider. You are absolutely right. Sometimes being invisible is the most powerful position in the room. Enjoy your meeting, Chelsea. I turned my back on her and swiped my black keycard against the security scanner next to the heavy oak doors. The light flashed green. The locking mechanism clicked open instantly. I pushed the door wide and stepped into the private executive suite, letting the heavy door swing shut. The last thing I saw was the smug, triumphant smile frozen on my sister's face, entirely ignorant of her impending doom. The executive suite was a hive of quiet, focused activity. My lead financial auditor, a brilliant forensic accountant named David, sat at a massive glass conference table surrounded by glowing monitors and thick stacks of printed documents. My executive assistant, Nora, stood behind him, coordinating the data flow with our corporate legal team back at the main headquarters. Madame CEO, David said, looking up from his primary monitor as I walked into the room. We received your message from the lobby. The team pulled the property records for your parents' address and cross-referenced the data with the Serenity Now vendor payments. You were absolutely correct. We found the smoking gun. I took off my charcoal jacket, draped it over the back of a leather chair, and rolled up my sleeves. Show me the numbers, David. I want to see exactly how she drained them. I walked over to the monitors and leaned over the table. David pulled up a split-screen display. On the left side were the personal banking and property records for my parents. On the right side were the internal corporate ledgers for Chelsea Company Serenity Now. Look at this transaction history, David explained, pointing a pen at the left screen. 14 months ago, your parents took out a secondary mortgage on their primary retirement residence for $600,000. The funds were deposited into their joint checking account on October 12th. 2 days later, on October 14th, exactly $600,000 was wired from that personal account directly into the Serenity Now corporate operating account. It was logged as an anonymous angel investment. I stared at the glowing numbers. They literally mortgaged their home to cover her initial failures, I said softly. But it gets worse, does it not? Much worse, David confirmed. He pointed to the right screen, highlighting a series of corporate expenses that occurred in November, just a few weeks after the cash injection. Chelsea did not use those funds for payroll, inventory, or operational costs. She immediately routed $400,000 through a shell vendor account. The vendor is listed as a marketing consulting firm, but the tax identification number tracks back to a luxury car dealership and a high-end real estate broker in Aspen, Colorado. She bought a luxury vehicle and funded a five-star ski vacation using the mortgage money my parents took out. I summarized, feeling a cold, calculating calm settle over my mind. Exactly, Nora chimed in, handing me a freshly printed dossier, and she repeated the process 3 more times over the past year. Every time her company accounts hit zero, your parents liquidated another asset. They sold a rental property in Florida. They emptied 2 separate retirement accounts. Each time the money hit the Serenity Now ledger, Chelsea siphoned a massive percentage of it to fund her personal lifestyle. Designer wardrobes, private flights, luxury spa retreats. She cooked the books to make these look like necessary corporate branding expenses. I took the printed dossier from Nora and flipped through the pages. The sheer audacity was staggering. Chelsea had not just failed at business. She had actively and deliberately embezzled over $1.2 million from her own parents. She had drained their entire life savings to maintain the illusion of success on social media. And my parents, blinded by their desperate need for their golden child to be a star, had handed over everything without ever demanding to look at the actual accounting. "What is the current status of the company today?" I asked, closing the folder and looking back at the monitors. "They are completely insolvent," David stated bluntly. "They have exactly $14,000 in liquid cash. They owe suppliers over $2 million. Their warehouse is threatening to seize all remaining inventory by the end of the business day if they do not receive a massive payment. That is why they are begging Apex Horizon for a $4 million buyout. They need to pay off the angry vendors and hide the embezzlement before the IRS or the Securities and Exchange Commission initiates a formal audit." I picked up my pen and tapped it rhythmically against the glass table. Chelsea was walking into the boardroom believing she could charm her way out of federal fraud. She thought she could smile and spin a few buzzwords to secure a massive corporate bailout. She thought she was dealing with faceless, easily manipulated suits who would not look too closely at the numbers. "Print all of this out," I commanded, my voice sharp and decisive. "I want the mortgage transfer dates highlighted in red. I want the corresponding luxury purchase receipts printed in full color. Put them in 3 separate binders. One for me, one for my legal counsel, and one for the center of the boardroom table." Nora immediately began organizing the documents for the printers. "Do you want security standing by inside the room during the pitch?" she asked. "No," I replied, picking up my charcoal jacket and slipping it back on. "Keep security in the hallway. I do not want anything to interrupt this presentation. I want Chelsea to feel completely in control when she starts her pitch. I want her to stand up in front of her parents and tell her beautiful, fabricated story about ethical wellness and family values. I want her to build her house of cards as high as it will possibly go." I adjusted my cuffs and looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the monitor. I looked powerful. I looked exactly like the corporate executioner my sister was about to face. Because when I finally knock that house of cards down, I want the crash to be deafening. "Gather the legal team, David. It is time to go meet the CEO." The main boardroom at the Oakwood Country Club was specifically designed to make people feel small. A massive slab of polished black marble stretched across the entire length of the center of the room, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass walls that overlooked the sprawling 18-hole golf course below. Heavy velvet drapes framed the glass, blocking out the glare of the morning sun, and the only sound in the room was the low, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock standing in the far corner. I stood in the adjoining observation suite, behind a pane of one-way glass, watching my family wait for their savior to arrive. My mother Linda sat rigidly at the far end of the marble table. She kept smoothing out the invisible wrinkles in her designer coat, her eyes darting nervously toward the heavy oak doors every time a waiter passed by in the hallway. My father Thomas was pacing. He walked back and forth along the glass wall, checking his gold watch every 30 seconds, occasionally wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. He looked exactly like a man who knew he was standing on the very edge of a massive financial cliff. And then there was Chelsea. She was seated in the center of the guest side, meticulously arranging her glossy pitch folders into perfectly symmetrical lines on the stone surface. Her foot bounced frantically under the table. The arrogant, dismissive attitude she had worn so proudly in the lobby was entirely gone, replaced by a suffocating, palpable desperation. She was rehearsing her opening lines, mouthing the words silently to herself, while gripping a silver pen so tightly her knuckles were white. They were completely terrified. They had mortgaged their entire existence on this single meeting. They were waiting for a faceless corporate entity to walk through those doors and grant them a $4 million miracle that would save them from total ruin. I waited until the grandfather clock struck exactly 10. I signaled to my security team waiting in the hallway. The two armed guards stepped forward and pulled the heavy oak doors open simultaneously, their polished shoes stepping aside to clear my path. The sudden sound of the doors opening caused all three of my family members to snap to attention. Thomas immediately stopped pacing and buttoned his suit jacket, plastering on a bright, eager, overly enthusiastic smile. Linda sat up perfectly straight, adjusting her posture to project absolute confidence and old money elegance. Chelsea stood up quickly, smoothing her crimson skirt and grabbing her primary presentation folder, ready to greet the billionaire investor who held her entire fate in their hands. I walked through the doorway alone. My footsteps echoed sharply on the hardwood floor as I crossed the threshold. I did not look at them. I kept my gaze fixed directly ahead, walking with the slow, measured pace of someone who owned the air in the room. I reached the head of the marble table, pulled out the heavy, high-backed leather executive chair, and sat down. I placed my hands flat on the cool stone surface, and finally shifted my gaze down the length of the long table to look directly at them. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Thomas' smile froze, then slowly contorted into a mask of pure confusion. He looked behind me toward the empty hallway, expecting someone else to follow. Linda let out a sharp, audible gasp, her hand flying to her chest as if she had just seen a ghost. Chelsea remained standing, clutching her glossy folder, her eyes wide with genuine shock. For several agonizing seconds, nobody moved an inch. The sheer impossibility of the situation was short-circuiting their brains. "Reese," my father finally said, his voice a harsh, angry hiss that sliced through the quiet room. "What on earth are you doing? Get out of that chair immediately. The investors will be here any second. Are you trying to completely humiliate us?" I did not move. I simply sat there, leaning back into the leather, watching them panic. Chelsea let out a strained, breathless, high-pitched laugh. She looked at our parents, then back at me, shaking her head as if trying to physically dislodge the reality unfolding in front of her. "Okay, very funny, Reese. You bribed someone on the staff to let you in here. It is a hilarious prank. Now get out. I am not playing games with you today. This is a multi-million-dollar business meeting. If the partners walk in and see the club barista sitting in the chairman's seat, they will cancel the entire deal. Get up right now." "You need to leave this room right now," Linda commanded, her voice trembling with rising, uncontrollable panic. "Thomas, call security. She is trying to sabotage your sister." I knew it. She has been planning this all morning to ruin Chelsea's presentation out of pure spite. I crossed my legs and rested my arms on the table. I did not speak a single word. I let their frantic, desperate accusations bounce off me like water off glass. Their immediate default was to treat me like a trespassing, vindictive child, completely incapable of comprehending the magnitude of their corporate presence. They were so deeply entrenched in their own delusional family hierarchy that they literally could not process the visual evidence sitting right in front of them. Thomas reached aggressively into his pocket for his phone, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "I am calling the club manager. You are going to be fired, Reese. You are going to be thrown out of this building in handcuffs, and I will personally make sure you never find employment in this city again." Before my father could dial a single number on his phone, the heavy oak doors swung wide open once again. My entire corporate acquisition team marched into the boardroom in perfect synchronized formation. David, my lead financial auditor, entered first carrying 3 thick black binders filled with damning evidence. Nora followed closely, flanked by 4 of our senior corporate attorneys, all dressed in immaculate dark custom-tailored suits. The sheer overwhelming presence of the executive team immediately silenced my parents. Thomas dropped his phone on the table with a clatter. Chelsea lowered her presentation folder, her eyes darting frantically between the imposing lawyers and the serious financial auditors filing into the room. David walked straight past my family without offering them so much as a glance. He approached the head of the table, stopped sharply beside my chair, and respectfully placed the primary thick black binder directly in front of me. "Everything is ready for your review, Madam CEO." David said, his voice clear, respectful, and echoing with professional authority. "We have the complete financial breakdown, the cross-referenced property deeds, and the final acquisition denial paperwork prepared for your signature." Nora moved to the other side of my chair, placing a sleek digital tablet on the table next to my hands. "The legal team is standing by to initiate the fraud flags the moment you conclude the pitch, Madam CEO," she added smoothly, her eyes briefly flicking toward my terrified family. My family stopped breathing entirely. The blood drained from Chelsea's face so rapidly, I genuinely thought she might collapse onto the floor. Her bright crimson suit suddenly looked entirely too large for her shrinking, trembling frame. She stared at David, then at Nora, and finally back to me. Her mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. The arrogant smirk, the vicious superiority, the constant mocking she had displayed in the lobby, it all evaporated in a single devastating instant of comprehension. Thomas gripped the back of his leather chair, his knuckles turning stark white, as his knees visibly buckled beneath him. He looked at the corporate lawyers who were now calmly taking their seats along the side of the massive table, opening their laptops, and ignoring my family entirely, as if they were nothing more than a minor administrative nuisance. Linda let out a small, strangled whimper, sinking slowly back into her seat. Her designer bag slid off her lap and crashed onto the floor, spilling its contents, but she did not even attempt to reach for it. They were finally putting all the pieces together. The lack of branding on my expensive suit, the calm, unbothered demeanor in the lobby, the fact that I had not been fetching coffee, but rather observing them from the very top of the food chain. The realization hit them with the violent force of a physical blow. The mysterious, ruthless venture capitalist they were begging for salvation was the exact same daughter they had abandoned 10 years ago for a $300 restaurant tab. I let them sit in their terror for a long, agonizing minute. I let them feel the absolute crushing weight of the power shift in the room. I wanted them to marinate in the knowledge that their financial executioner was the family scapegoat they had despised. I wanted them to realize that all the lies they had told their country club friends, all the fake narratives they had built about my supposed failures were about to be violently dismantled by a team of ruthless corporate lawyers. I slowly reached forward and placed my hands firmly on the black binder David had provided. I opened the cover, the sharp sound of the turning page echoing loudly in the dead silent room. I did not look at my parents. I did not look at my father shaking hands, or my mother horrified, pale face. I locked my eyes entirely on Chelsea. My sister stood frozen at the opposite end of the vast marble table. She looked incredibly small, deeply terrified, and utterly exposed. The glossy presentation folders she had clutched like a shield now hung uselessly at her side. She was a fraud standing in front of a highly trained corporate firing squad, and she finally knew it. I leaned forward, steepling my fingers together on top of the financial audit. "You asked for $4 million, Chelsea," I said, my voice cold, sharp, and echoing with absolute uncompromising authority. "Impress me." The air in the boardroom turned to absolute ice. My parents froze, their eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated terror. Chelsea's jaw snapped shut, her chest heaving as the last remnants of her corporate facade burned to the ground. The true financial autopsy was finally about to begin. I turned my attention away from my sister and looked directly at Thomas and Linda. They were clutching the edge of the marble table, desperate for an anchor as their carefully constructed reality began to tilt. "You think you are protecting a successful entrepreneur?" I said, addressing my parents with surgical precision. You think you are investing in a luxury brand that just needs a little more time to find its footing. You have spent the last 10 years convincing yourselves that Chelsea is a business prodigy because admitting the truth would destroy the entire narrative of this family. Thomas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above his tight collar. "We are her initial investors," he stammered, his voice lacking any of its previous booming authority. "It is perfectly normal for a family to provide seed capital. Seed capital is an investment designed to yield a return," I corrected sharply. "What you have been providing is a life support system for a terminal patient, and your daughter has been cutting the power cord to fund her own vanity." I gestured to David. My lead auditor tapped his digital tablet, and the massive presentation screen behind me instantly flickered to life. The display illuminated the dark boardroom with stark, high-definition spreadsheets. "I want to direct your attention to the screen I instructed my parents. These are the internal operating ledgers for Serenity Now. We acquired them during our standard pre-meeting due diligence." Linda squinted at this massive wall of numbers, her face twisting in confusion. "I do not understand what we are looking at. These are just accounting files." "Let me translate them for you," I offered coldly. I stood up from my heavy leather chair and walked to the side of the table, commanding the full attention of the room. 14 months ago, the two of you took out a secondary mortgage on your primary residence. You pulled exactly $600,000 in equity out of your home. 2 days later, that exact amount was wired into Chelsea corporate accounts. Thomas bristled, trying to summon a shred of defiance. "That was a private family decision. It is none of your business how we choose to support our daughter. It becomes my business the second you ask my firm to bail you out of the consequences." I fired back, my voice echoing off the glass walls. "Because I need to know if the company I am buying has a competent CEO. And the numbers prove that your golden child is not just incompetent, she is actively stealing from you." Chelsea let out a loud, panicked gasp. "Shut up. Shut up right now. You are making things up to turn them against me. Mom, do not listen to her. She manipulated these files. She is trying to destroy us." I ignored Chelsea entirely. I tapped a button on my own remote, and the screen transitioned to a new set of documents. Side by side, the display showed the corporate bank transfers from Serenity Now next to heavily redacted but clearly identifiable vendor receipts. "Watch closely," I told my parents. "The $600,000 you provided was supposed to secure manufacturing contracts and warehouse space. But that is not where the money went." Less than 48 hours after your life savings hit her corporate account, Chelsea wired $400,000 to a Shell LLC, registered under a different name. My parents stared at the screen, their eyes tracking the highlighted red lines connecting the bank transfers. "That shell company," I continued relentlessly, "is not a manufacturing vendor. The tax identification number routes directly to a luxury foreign auto dealership and a high-end real estate broker in Aspen, Colorado. She took your mortgage money, classified it as a marketing consulting expense on the corporate ledger, and used it to purchase a customized luxury SUV and fund a 5-star month-long ski vacation." Linda let out a sharp, choked sound. She turned her head slowly, looking at Chelsea. "Chelsea, what is she talking about?" "You told us that money was going toward securing the overseas shipping routes. You said it was critical infrastructure." Chelsea backed away from the table, her hands raised defensively. "I needed to project success, Mom. You do not get it. Investors in the wellness space need to see a certain lifestyle. The car and the Aspen trip were entirely for branding purposes. It was content creation. It was a business necessity. A business necessity." I repeated softly, the mockery clear in my tone. I clicked the remote again, the screen flooded with dozens of smaller rapid-fire transactions. "Let us look at the rest of your business necessities." I walked slowly down the length of the marble table as I read the list of embezzled funds aloud. $10,000 at a designer boutique in Paris, classified as uniform expenses. $35,000 for private jet charters to Miami, logged as investor networking. $50,000 in personal credit card debt, quietly paid off using the company operational funds, hiding behind fake vendor invoices. Thomas sank heavily into his chair. His face had turned a sickly ash-gray color. He took off his glasses, his hands shaking violently as he rubbed his eyes. My father, the man who had always demanded absolute financial responsibility from me, was watching his entire life's work evaporate on a presentation screen. You did not just do this once, I stated, driving the final nail into the coffin. You repeated this exact process 3 times over the last year. Every single time your company was about to bounce a payroll check, you manufactured a crisis. You went to your parents crying about supply chain issues or aggressive market expansions. You convinced them to liquidate a rental property in Florida. You convinced them to empty 2 separate retirement accounts. And every time they handed you the cash, you siphoned off a massive percentage to fund your personal lavish lifestyle. Chelsea was trembling now. Her arrogant posture had completely collapsed. She looked like a cornered rat, darting her eyes toward the heavy oak doors, desperately looking for an escape route that did not exist. It was an advance on my future salary, Chelsea stammered, her voice thin and reedy. I was going to pay it all back the second the company turned a profit. I am the founder. I am entitled to compensation for my vision. You do not have a vision, I shot back, stopping directly across the table from her. You have a delusion. And you funded it by financially ruining the only 2 people on Earth foolish enough to blindly trust you. Linda buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, devastating sobs. The designer coat she wore suddenly looked like a tragic costume. The reality of her situation was finally breaking through decades of denial. They were completely broke. They had traded their financial security for the illusion of a perfect, successful daughter, and the illusion had just shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Thomas looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a sudden, desperate pleading. Reese, please. We did not know. We trusted her. If we do not get this $4 million buyout today, the bank is going to foreclose on the house next week. We will have absolutely nothing left. You have to help us. You are our daughter. I looked down at the man who had thrown a $50 bill at me and told me to figure it out. He was begging for mercy from the very person he had discarded. I walked back to the head of the table and stood behind my heavy leather chair. I looked at David and Nora, who were waiting in perfect silence for my final command. I looked at the wall of corporate lawyers who had meticulously documented every single word of Chelsea admission to misusing corporate funds. Then I looked at the glowing screen, turned it off with a single click, and prepared to drop the final, most personal weapon I possessed. The silence in the boardroom was heavy and suffocating. My father's desperate plea for salvation hung in the air, pathetic and entirely misplaced. He still did not understand. He still believed that the shell of a company Chelsea had built possessed some inherent value that could justify a $4 million bailout. He thought I was just a bitter sister withholding a check out of spite. He did not grasp that as a venture capitalist I operated strictly on metrics, and his golden child metrics were a catastrophic failure. I had turned the screen off, ready to deliver my final personal blow, but looking at his tear-filled eyes, I realized he needed to see the complete and total destruction of the business he had sacrificed his life for. You think this company is an asset, I said, my voice echoing coldly off the glass walls. You are begging me to write a $4 million check to save your house under the delusion that Serenity Now is a functioning business on the verge of a breakthrough. You think Apex Horizon would ever acquire something this toxic? Let me show you what you are actually asking me to buy. I tapped the remote in my hand. The massive presentation screen flickered back to life, illuminating the dark mahogany table with a blinding array of red charts and plummeting graphs. I gestured for David to proceed. Pull up the quarterly revenue projections she submitted in her initial pitch deck, I commanded. David tapped his tablet, and the screen changed to show a towering, optimistic bar graph predicting astronomical growth over the next fiscal year. Chelsea had presented a narrative of a lifestyle brand on the precipice of global domination. The numbers she had submitted suggested exponential user acquisition and massive retail partnerships. Now, I said, leaning forward and locking eyes with Chelsea, overlay the actual audited sales data from the past 18 months. The towering green bars on the screen instantly collapsed. They were replaced by a flat, stagnant red line that barely hovered above zero. The visual representation of her failure was absolute. Chelsea shrank back in her chair, her hands trembling as she stared at the undeniable proof of her incompetence. "Your revenue projections are completely fabricated," I stated, walking slowly around the edge of the marble table. "You claimed a 300% growth in direct-to-consumer sales. But our audit reveals that your customer acquisition cost is utterly unsustainable. You are spending $300 in digital advertising to acquire a customer who spends $40 on your website. Your return on investment does not exist. You are setting money on fire just to drive traffic to a broken storefront." Thomas stared at the plummeting red line, his mouth hanging slightly open. "But the social media," he stammered, looking confused. "She has millions of followers. We see the engagement. Followers do not equal revenue." "Thomas," I corrected him sharply, "especially when 80% of those followers are purchased bots, a fact our analytics team confirmed yesterday. You cannot pay your mortgage with fake internet engagement." I signaled David again. The screen shifted to a detailed breakdown of the corporate liabilities. "Let us look at your crippling debt," I continued relentlessly. "You owe $2 million to raw material suppliers across the supply chain. You have outstanding invoices dating back 9 months. Your warehouses are currently packed to the ceiling with defective inventory that cannot be sold because you refuse to pay for basic quality control inspections. You are facing 3 separate breach of contract lawsuits from your packaging vendors. Your company has negative equity. The brand is completely worthless." Linda slammed her hand down on the marble table. The sharp smack made Thomas flinch, but I did not blink. My mother's face was flushed with a mixture of terror and desperate classist indignation. She could not accept that her entire worldview was crashing down around her. "You do not understand how this industry works. Reese," Linda shouted, her voice shrill and grating. "You have spent your life sitting behind a computer screen crunching numbers, but Chelsea is building an empire. She is an influencer. She is a brand. The things you are calling a waste of money are standard corporate networking." I stopped pacing and looked at my mother. The sheer magnitude of her delusion was almost fascinating. "Standard corporate networking?" I asked quietly. "Yes," Linda insisted, lifting her chin and trying to project the old money authority she had always faked so well. "She attends the right galas. She meets with the right people. You have to spend money to make money in the wellness space. It is about projecting an aspirational lifestyle. You do not understand real wealth, Reese. You never have. You just look at spreadsheets, but Chelsea operates in a completely different social stratosphere. She is securing relationships that will pay off tenfold." I let out a short, hollow laugh. "Real wealth does not bounce payroll checks, Linda. Real wealth does not secretly mortgage a retirement home to pay off angry logistics vendors. You are confusing the performance of wealth with actual capital, and your daughter has manipulated your ignorance to fund her own vanity." I turned my back on my mother and focused on the massive screen. I was tired of her desperate attempts to defend a sinking ship. It was time to dissect the specific granular details of Chelsea financial sabotage. David displayed the operational budget line items I instructed. The screen instantly populated with hundreds of rows of financial data. I picked up a laser pointer from the table and directed the bright green dot toward a cluster of highly inflated expenses categorized under daily operations. "You call this standard corporate networking," I said, my voice slicing through my mother-weak defenses. "Let us look closely at these specific, exorbitant, and entirely unexplained expenses. Here we have a line item labeled vendor payments for $70,000 in March." I clicked the remote, pulling up the corresponding invoices my legal team had subpoenaed. This $70,000 vendor payment was not for manufacturing, shipping, or retail distribution, I stated. It was wired directly to a luxury wellness retreat in Tulum, Mexico. Chelsea flew herself and 6 of her friends down there on a private charter. She classified it as a marketing retreat. Yet our audit confirms that absolutely 0 marketing materials, 0 photo shoots, and 0 brand campaigns were produced during this trip. It was a week-long vacation, entirely funded by corporate debt. Chelsea's face had turned a sickly shade of gray. She opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords seemed to have completely seized up. She looked at the team of corporate lawyers taking meticulous notes along the wall, realizing that every single fraudulent charge was being permanently entered into the legal record of this acquisition denial. I moved the laser pointer down the screen, highlighting another cluster of massive expenditures. Here is another fascinating line item from last quarter. $200,000 categorized as brand development consulting. I stepped closer to Chelsea, leaning slightly over the table to look her directly in the eyes. I had my forensic accountants trace the routing numbers for this consulting firm. Do you want to tell your parents who owns that consulting firm, Chelsea? Do you want to tell them who the registered agent is? Chelsea squeezed her eyes shut and shook her head tightly, a pathetic attempt to hide from the reality closing in on her. The registered agent is your personal life coach, I revealed, turning my gaze back to Thomas and Linda. She paid her personal life coach $200,000 of company money that came directly from your home equity line of credit, and logged it as a corporate brand development expense. There are no deliverables. There are no consulting reports. There is just a massive gaping hole where your retirement savings used to be. Thomas gripped his chest, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. He looked at the screen, reading the undeniable proof of his daughter's deceit. He had spent his entire life demanding perfection from me, punishing me for every minor flaw, all while enabling a daughter who viewed him as nothing more than a personal ATM to be drained and discarded. "This is what you asked me to buy," I told my father, my voice completely devoid of pity. "You walked into this boardroom expecting Apex Horizon to hand you $4 million to reward this catastrophic failure. You expected me to validate a business model that relies entirely on fraud, embezzlement, and the financial abuse of eager, naive investors." I walked back to my executive chair and sat down heavily. The financial autopsy was complete. There was absolutely nothing left of Serenity now but exposed bones and rotting ledgers. I had dismantled her inflated revenue, exposed her crippling corporate debt, and laid bare the specific exorbitant lies she used to maintain her false image. My mother sat in stunned silence, the fight finally draining completely out of her. She could no longer defend the standard corporate networking. She could no longer claim I did not understand real wealth. She was forced to sit in the ruins of the empire she thought she had helped build, realizing it was nothing but a tomb. Chelsea was weeping now, silent, miserable tears ruining her expensive makeup. She had nowhere left to hide. The numbers had trapped her, illuminated on a massive screen for the entire executive team to witness. I folded my hands on the table and looked at the three of them. "The business is dead," I stated definitively. "The financial reality is undeniable. But the worst part of this entire situation is not the money she stole from the company. The worst part is the lie she told to get it." I reached for the final, most devastating file on my desk. It was time to close the circle. It was time to remind them exactly what they had sacrificed 10 years ago, and exactly what that sacrifice had truly been worth. I opened the thick black folder sitting at the center of my desk and flattened the pages with the palm of my hand. The room was so silent I could hear the erratic, shallow breathing of my father at the opposite end of the table. I looked up at the massive digital display illuminating the boardroom and gave David a subtle nod. "Let us look at the anatomy of a financial betrayal," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, dangerous authority. "It is one thing to see a list of fraudulent corporate expenses on a spreadsheet. It is entirely another to look at the actual receipts." David projected the purchasing agreements for the vehicle and the Aspen property. The screen shifted instantly. The sterile rows of accounting data vanished, replaced by high-resolution scans of original signed purchasing documents. On the left side of the screen was a bill of sale from an elite foreign auto importer. On the right was a detailed itemized invoice from one of the most exclusive private resort properties in Aspen. Both documents bore Chelsea's distinct looping signature at the bottom. I stepped away from my chair and walked slowly along the edge of the marble table, drawing the eyes of every person in the room toward the undeniable proof. "Look at the invoice on the left," I instructed, pointing my laser pen at the glowing document. "That is the purchasing agreement for a fully loaded, custom-ordered luxury SUV. The base price was $140,000. But Chelsea did not stop at the base model. She added $40,000 in custom interior upgrades, including imported leather and a premium sound system. The total cost was $180,000 paid in full with a single wire transfer from the Serenity Now corporate account. Chelsea sank lower in her chair, refusing to look at the screen. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, staring down at her lap as if she could somehow wish herself out of the room. Now look at the invoice on the right. I continued moving the laser pointer to the second document. This is the itemized bill for the Aspen marketing retreat you defended so passionately, Mom. Let us read what standard corporate networking actually entails. 7 nights in a private ski-out villa. $25,000 for a private executive chef. $12,000 for chartered helicopter transfers from the airport. $18,000 logged entirely under premium champagne and top-shelf liquor. There is not a single line item on this invoice for photographers, marketing consultants, or promotional materials. It was a lavish, drunken vacation disguised as a corporate write-off. My mother stared at the screen, her eyes wide and unblinking. The designer coat she wore seemed to swallow her whole. She was looking at the exact items her retirement savings had purchased, and the reality was finally piercing through her decades of willful ignorance. But the absolute worst part of this fraud is not what she bought, I said, bringing the room back to my voice. The worst part is exactly when she bought it. David overlaid the banking timestamps. A new graphic appeared on the presentation screen. It was a linear timeline broken down into exact dates, hours, and minutes. I wanted my parents to see the precise pipeline of their financial ruin. I wanted them to understand the sheer malice and calculation of their golden child. On the 14th of October, at exactly 9 in the morning, you and Thomas sat in a bank manager office, I said, looking directly at my parents. You signed the paperwork to take out a secondary mortgage on your home. You pledged the roof over your heads to secure $600,000 in cash, believing you were saving your daughter company from a tough market. My father swallowed hard, his face a portrait of absolute misery. He nodded slowly, clearly remembering the exact morning they had signed their financial security away. At 1 in the afternoon on that same day, I continued tracing the timeline with the laser pointer that $600,000 was deposited into your personal checking account. At 1:15, you initiated the wire transfer to the Serenity Now operating account. At 2:30, the funds officially cleared and became available to Chelsea. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, forcing them to hang on my next words. At exactly 2:45 in the afternoon, barely 15 minutes after your life savings hit her account, Chelsea authorized the wire transfer to the foreign auto dealership to purchase her customized SUV. At 3:30, she wired the deposit to the Aspen Resort. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom seemed to lock us all inside this suffocating truth. I watched the realization hit my parents like a physical blow. She did not wait a week, I stated, my voice ringing with cold, hard facts. She did not wait to see if the market would turn. She did not use your money to pay off the angry vendors or secure the warehouse inventory. The very second your mortgage money cleared, she immediately stole it to buy herself a luxury car and a vacation. She knew exactly what she was doing. She watched you sign your house away, and she rewarded herself with a shopping spree. Thomas let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He slumped forward, resting his elbows on his knees and burying his face in his trembling hands. The proud, arrogant man who had strutted into the country club lobby an hour ago was completely gone. He was broken, shattered by the undeniable proof that his favorite daughter had knowingly and willingly destroyed him. Linda sat rigidly in her chair, her hands gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles were white. Her eyes darted from the time-stamped banking records to Chelsea, who was still refusing to look up from her lap. Chelsea. Linda whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the betrayal. Tell me this is a mistake. Tell me you did not take the house money for a car. We told you we were risking everything for that loan. We told you the bank would foreclose if we missed a payment. You promised us it was for the manufacturing contracts. Chelsea finally snapped. The pressure of the room, the suffocating presence of my corporate legal team, and the absolute destruction of her lies pushed her over the edge. She slammed her hands down on the marble table and glared at our mother. "Stop looking at me like that!" Chelsea shouted, her voice shrill and defensive. "I needed the car. I am a CEO. I cannot pull up to investor meetings in a 5-year-old sedan. I have an image to maintain. If I do not look successful, nobody is going to invest in the brand. You are the ones who always taught me that appearances matter. I was just doing exactly what you raised me to do." The sheer audacity of her defense stunned the room. She was entirely incapable of remorse. Instead of apologizing for bankrupting her parents, she was actively blaming them for teaching her to be a superficial fraud. "You stole from us," Thomas said, lifting his head from his hands. His voice was completely hollow, drained of all its usual bluster and volume. "We have nothing left, Chelsea. We emptied the retirement accounts. We sold the Florida property. We are going to lose the house next week because we cannot make the mortgage payment. You knew we were drowning and you went on a ski trip." "I was going to pay it back!" Chelsea screamed, her face turning a blotchy, furious red. "The company just needed a little more time to scale. If you people had just given me more support, if you had not been so cheap, I would not have had to move funds around. It is not my fault the market is terrible right now. It is not my fault the vendors are being unreasonable." She was unraveling completely, doubling down on her delusion, even as the irrefutable evidence glowed on the screen behind me. She truly believed that she was the victim. She believed that her parents losing their home was simply an unfortunate side effect of her grand entrepreneurial journey. I stood quietly at the head of the table, watching the dynamic play out. For 10 years, I had wondered what it would take for my parents to finally see Chelsea for who she truly was. I had wondered if there was any limit to their blind devotion. Now I had my answer. It took their total financial annihilation. It took the absolute loss of their home and their savings to finally break the spell. Linda stared at her eldest daughter with a look of profound, horrified disgust. The golden child, the perfect daughter she had spent decades holding over my head as the ultimate standard of success, was nothing more than a selfish, manipulative thief. The realization was physically sickening to watch. Linda realized that she had alienated and abandoned her youngest daughter to fiercely protect a woman who viewed her as nothing more than a disposable bank account. "You have not been struggling with a tough market," I said, directing my voice to Chelsea to cut off her frantic excuses. "You have not been fighting supply chain issues or aggressive competitors. You have simply been defrauding your own family to fund a lavish personal lifestyle you could never actually afford. You are a financial parasite, Chelsea, and you finally ran out of hosts to drain." I looked at my corporate legal team. They were watching the exchange with professional detachment, their laptops recording every admission of guilt Chelsea had just screamed across the boardroom. The evidence of her embezzlement was now officially documented by a third-party venture capital firm. She had just confessed to wire fraud in front of 5 corporate attorneys. Thomas turned his tear-filled eyes toward me. He looked pathetic, completely stripped of the arrogant armor he had worn his entire life. He finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. He had bet his entire existence on the wrong daughter, and he had lost everything. Reese Thomas pleaded, his voice barely a whisper. "We are ruined. We have absolutely nothing left. If Apex Horizon does not buy the company today, the bank takes the house on Monday. We will be out on the street. Please, you have all this power. You have to save us." I looked at the man who had thrown a $50 bill on my birthday table. I looked at the woman who had called me heartless for exposing Chelsea lies a decade ago. I looked at the sister who had just blamed her parents for not giving her enough money to steal. The financial autopsy was complete. The embezzlement was exposed. But there was still one final piece of business to attend to. There was one last document that needed to be shown before I delivered my final verdict. I reached for the slim gray folder resting at the bottom of my stack. It was time to show them exactly why I felt absolutely no pity for their impending ruin. I opened the slim gray folder resting at the bottom of my stack. The heavy silence in the boardroom amplified the sound of the paper sliding across the polished marble. I looked at my father, who was still staring at me with desperate, pleading eyes, begging for a $4 million miracle to save his home. "You asked me to save you," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. You want me to write a massive corporate check to rescue you from the total financial ruin your golden child created. But before I give you the final decision of Apex Horizon, I want to take a brief trip down memory lane. I want to show you exactly why I feel absolutely no pity for the position you are in today. I signaled David with a subtle nod. The massive digital display behind me shifted instantly. The red graphs and current corporate ledgers vanished. In their place, a new set of scanned documents appeared. These documents were not recent. The dates stamped at the top of the pages were from exactly 10 years ago, the exact date of my 23rd birthday. Let us rewind a decade, I instructed, pacing slowly behind my leather chair. Let us go back to that dimly lit steakhouse. You both abandoned my birthday dinner because Chelsea called you in hysterics. She claimed she was robbed, stripped of her purse and keys, and left stranded in the freezing cold outside a luxury ski resort. When I showed you the GPS tracking data and the banking applications that proved she was sitting in a heated bar drinking $20 cocktails, you called me jealous. You called me heartless. You threw a $50 bill onto the table to cover a $300 check and walked out on me. Linda flinched violently at the memory. She squeezed her eyes shut, unable to look at the date projected on the screen. Thomas swallowed hard, his hands trembling on his lap. He clearly did not understand why I was bringing up ancient family history in the middle of a corporate acquisition meeting. I did not just walk away that night and forget about it. I continued, my voice echoing off the glass walls. A few months after I launched my first successful software platform, I hired a private investigator. I wanted to know exactly what my family traded my existence for. I wanted the undeniable truth, and the truth is right there on the screen behind me. I picked up the laser pointer and directed the bright green dot toward the first document on the left. This is an official police dispatch log from the local jurisdiction of that ski resort, acquired through a standard public records request. Read it carefully, Thomas. You will notice that on the night in question, there were absolutely zero reports of robbery, theft, or muggings anywhere near that resort. No police officers were dispatched. No police reports were filed, because no crime ever occurred. Chelsea shrank down in her chair, her face turning completely pale. She had assumed that her decade-old lie was safely buried in the past. She never imagined that the sister she mocked as a coffee-fetching assistant possessed the resources to legally dissect her entire history. Now look at the document on the right, I commanded, moving the laser pointer. This is the itemized hotel folio and the corresponding credit card statements from Chelsea accounts. We acquired these legally during the current corporate audit, since she foolishly intermingled her old personal accounts with her new business ledgers. I traced the line items with the laser, forcing my parents to read the exact charges. Chelsea credit card was indeed declined for her luxury hotel room that night. But do you want to know why it was declined? It was not because her purse was stolen. It was because she had maxed out her credit limit entirely on her own. Earlier that afternoon, she spent $3,000 at a designer handbag boutique in the resort village. She spent another $1,200 on luxury ski apparel that she never even skied in. I walked around the table, stopping directly behind Chelsea's chair. She went on a massive shopping spree, realized she could not pay her hotel bill, and panicked. Instead of calling you and admitting she was financially irresponsible, she manufactured a trauma. She invented a violent robbery, so you would drop everything, drive 3 hours into the mountains, and blindly pay her bill. I looked at my mother, whose face was buried in her hands. And you fell for it completely. You arrived at that resort, paid her exorbitant hotel tab, and probably comforted her all the way home. You completely ignored the fact that she was holding 3 brand new designer shopping bags. You were so blinded by your absolute obsession with her that you willingly played the fool. Thomas let out a ragged, choking breath. He looked at Chelsea, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. You lied to us, he whispered, his voice cracking. You made us leave your sister on her birthday so we could pay for your handbags. Do not act surprised, Thomas, I snapped, cutting off his sudden attempt at moral outrage. This is not a new problem. This embezzlement we uncovered today is not an isolated incident. This is the exact same pattern, just scaled up. 10 years ago, she defrauded you for a few $1,000s to buy designer bags and you rewarded her for it. You protected her. You validated her lies. You taught her that her emergencies, no matter how entirely fabricated, were always more important than my reality. I stepped away from Chelsea and walked back to the head of the table. I wanted them to see me standing there powerful and uncompromising as I delivered the final crushing blow. You spent your entire lives cultivating this monster, I stated, gesturing toward my sister. You fed her entitlement every single day. You shielded her from every logical consequence. You made absolutely sure she never had to experience a single moment of accountability in her entire life. And you did it by actively destroying my confidence. You did it by calling me plain ordinary and a disappointment. You drained your own life savings to keep her illusion alive because her fake success was the only thing propping up your massive egos. The corporate lawyers lining the wall sat in perfect, motionless silence. They were witnessing a psychological dismantling of an entire family structure grounded entirely in financial facts. They knew better than to interrupt. Your lifelong favoritism has culminated in this exact moment, I said, leaning forward and placing my hands flat on the marble. Your golden child has successfully defrauded you out of $1.2 million. She took your retirement, she took your home, she took your dignity, she took everything you had to give, and she used it to buy a luxury SUV and a ski vacation. Linda lifted her head from her hands. Her makeup was completely ruined, dark streaks running down her cheeks. She looked absolutely destroyed, stripped of all her country club pretense and arrogant superiority. We are sorry, Reese. My mother sobbed, her voice raw and pleading. We are so sorry. We were fools. We lost you for nothing. Please, you have to believe me. We made a terrible mistake. Foolish is forgetting to lock your front door, Linda. I corrected her, my tone remaining ruthlessly cold. What you did was systematic, deliberate enablement. You chose to be blind because seeing the truth would mean admitting your favorite daughter was a fraud. You chose your own ego over my existence. You did not lose me. You threw me away. Thomas stood up slowly, his legs trembling. He looked like a man standing before a firing squad. Reese, I am begging you. Let us make this right. Let us fix it. I will do whatever it takes. I will work for you. I will pay you back every cent. Just please do not let the bank take our home. You have the power to save us today. I looked at my father, taking in his desperate, pathetic stance. I felt absolutely no satisfaction, no joy, and no anger. I felt nothing but a cool, clinical detachment. I was looking at strangers who had made a catastrophic business investment and lost. The most poetic part of this entire tragedy, I said softly, the silence in the room magnifying every syllable, is that the daughter you threw away is the only person on this planet who possesses the capital to save you from the daughter you kept. I have the power to write a check right now that would clear your mortgages, pay off the angry vendors, and make this entire nightmare disappear. I could save you with a single stroke of my pen. Thomas and Linda leaned forward, a desperate, frantic spark of hope igniting in their eyes. Even Chelsea looked up, her tear-stained face, reflecting a sudden selfish relief. They still believed that because we shared blood, I would ultimately rescue them. They believed the family bond they had so casually discarded would somehow obligate me to be their savior. I picked up my silver fountain pen and held it suspended over the acquisition denial paperwork. I looked at the three of them, watching them hold their breath, waiting for the miracle they believed they were entitled to. I watched the realization settle over the boardroom. The silence was absolute, heavy with the devastating weight of the truth. Chelsea's carefully curated image was completely shattered. The polished, successful CEO facade she had maintained for years evaporated in a matter of seconds, revealing the desperate, entitled child underneath. She was backed into a corner, surrounded by indisputable financial records, legal documentation, and the undeniable reality of her own actions. The panic in her eyes morphed into pure, unadulterated rage. "It is not fair!" Chelsea screamed, her voice cracking as she slammed her hands onto the marble table. The sound echoed violently off the glass walls. The sudden outburst made my mother jump in her seat while my father stared at Chelsea as if he were seeing a stranger. Chelsea was breathing heavily. Her face flushed a dark, angry red. "You set me up," she accused, pointing a trembling finger directly at me. "You deliberately orchestrated this entire meeting just to humiliate me. You lured me here under the guise of an investment just so you could pull this vindictive stunt in front of your lawyers. You have always been jealous of me, Reese. You could never stand the fact that Mom and Dad love me more, so you spent 10 years plotting this pathetic revenge." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I remained seated at the head of the table, perfectly calm, letting her dig her own grave. "I did not set you up, Chelsea," I replied evenly. "You submitted a formal pitch request to my firm. You came to Apex Horizon begging for a $4 million bailout because you have completely mismanaged your company into the ground. I simply authorized a standard due diligence audit, which is required for any potential acquisition. The fact that the audit revealed massive systematic embezzlement is entirely your own doing. You dug this hole yourself. I am merely pointing out how deep it goes." Chelsea let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Embezzlement. You call it embezzlement, I call it survival. I was building a brand. I was building an empire. You do not understand the pressure I was under. Do you have any idea how much it costs to maintain the image of a successful female entrepreneur in this market? The clothes, the travel, the constant networking. It is a full-time job just projecting the right lifestyle. I had to look the part so investors would take me seriously. You stole from your own parents to buy a luxury car," I stated flatly, cutting through her delusional justifications. "You drained their retirement accounts to go on a ski vacation. That is not brand building. That is theft." Chelsea turned her fury away from me and directed it squarely at our parents. "They owed it to me," she yelled, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. "It is their fault I was in this position in the first place. If they had just given me a proper trust fund or a larger initial investment, I would not have had to move money around. But no, they were always so cheap. They gave me scraps and expected me to perform miracles." Thomas looked at Chelsea with an expression of profound, devastating heartbreak. "Scraps," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We gave you everything, Chelsea. We took out a second mortgage on our home. We emptied our retirement savings. We sold the Florida property. We gave you over $1 million. We gave you everything we had to secure your future. It was not enough." Chelsea screamed back, completely devoid of empathy. "It was never enough. You think $1 million is real money in the wellness industry? It is pocket change. I needed 10 times that amount to compete. You raised me to be a star. You raised me to be the best. You told me my entire life that I deserved the world, but you did not actually provide the capital to make it happen. You set me up to fail by expecting me to build an empire on a pathetic budget." Linda let out a choked sob. She reached a trembling hand across the table toward Chelsea. "Sweetheart, please," she pleaded, tears streaming down her ruined makeup. "We did our best. We sacrificed everything for you. We believed in your vision. We love you." "Do not call me sweetheart," Chelsea snapped, recoiling from our mother outstretched hand as if it were toxic. "You only believed in my vision because you wanted the social status. You wanted to brag to your country club friends about your successful CEO daughter. You used me to elevate your own pathetic social standing. And now that things are difficult, you are sitting there acting like martyrs. You are acting like I forced you to write those checks. You gave me that money voluntarily because you needed me to be a success story." The absolute cruelty of her words stunned the room. Chelsea was not just refusing to take responsibility for her actions. She was actively blaming her parents for not providing enough money for her to steal. She felt entirely justified in bankrupting them because they had raised her to believe she was entitled to their resources. Chelsea Thomas said, his voice breaking, "We are going to lose the house. We have no savings left. The bank is foreclosing next week. We have nowhere to go." "That is not my problem," Chelsea sneered, her face contorted into a mask of pure selfish rage. "You are adults. You made your own financial decisions. If you were stupid enough to mortgage your house without running a proper risk assessment, that is on you. I am not going to let you drag me down with your bad choices." The silence that followed was deafening. My parents stared at the daughter they had worshipped, the daughter they had sacrificed everything for, and finally saw the monster they had created. They had spent decades feeding her ego, shielding her from consequences, and punishing me for not being exactly like her. Now they were facing the ultimate consequence of their parenting. Their golden child did not love them. She did not care about their sacrifices. She viewed them as nothing more than a failed investment. I looked at my parents, taking in their shattered expressions. For 10 years, I had wondered if they would ever realize the truth about Chelsea. I had wondered if they would ever see the manipulation and the lies. The vindication I felt in this moment was absolute, but it brought no joy. It was simply the cold, hard reality of natural consequences playing out in real time. "You are a toxic, miserable person, Reese," Chelsea hissed, turning her attention back to me. "You think you have won because you have a fancy title and a team of lawyers. You think exposing me makes you better than us. But you are just as pathetic as they are. You are so desperate for validation that you orchestrated this entire production just to get back at me for being the favorite." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the marble table. "I am not desperate for validation." "Chelsea," I said quietly, my voice slicing through her hysterical rant. "I already have everything I need. I built an empire without a single dime of their money or a single ounce of their support. I am not seeking revenge. I am simply delivering a business decision." I picked up the final acquisition denial paperwork resting in the gray folder. I uncapped my silver fountain pen and signed my name on the bottom line with a smooth, decisive stroke. Apex Horizon officially declines the acquisition of Serenity. Now I stated, my voice echoing with finality. The company is completely insolvent. The financial records indicate systematic embezzlement, fraud, and severe mismanagement of corporate funds. We will not proceed with any funding or buyout negotiations. Chelsea stared at the signed document, the reality of her situation finally crashing down on her. The $4 million bailout was gone. The company was dead. The angry vendors, the outstanding invoices, the looming threat of an IRS audit. It was all rushing toward her, and she had absolutely no way out. "You cannot do this," Chelsea whispered, her voice cracking with genuine fear. "The warehouse is seizing the inventory today. The bank is calling the loans. I am going to be ruined." "You ruined yourself," I corrected her. "You made the choices. You spent the money. You forged the documents. Now you get to experience the one thing our parents never allowed you to face: consequences." Chelsea let out a guttural scream of pure frustration. She grabbed her glossy pitch folders from the table and hurled them across the room. The heavy binders slammed against the glass wallpapers, scattering wildly across the polished floor. She turned toward the heavy oak doors, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with panic and fury. "I am done with all of you," Chelsea yelled, glaring at our parents one last time. "You are all useless. I am going to find investors who actually understand my vision. I am going to build this company back up, and when I am on the cover of Forbes, none of you will get a single cent. You are dead to me." She turned and stormed out of the boardroom. She did not look back. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind her, echoing with a loud, definitive thud that signaled the absolute end of the golden child reign. The silence returned to the boardroom, heavier and more suffocating than before. My parents sat frozen in their chairs, surrounded by the scattered papers of Chelsea ruined presentation. They had just watched their favorite daughter, the center of their universe, verbally eviscerate them and abandon them in their darkest hour. I remained seated at the head of the table, perfectly calm, perfectly composed. I looked at the legal team, who were quietly closing their laptops and packing their briefcases. The presentation was over. The fraud had been exposed. The golden child had imploded exactly as I knew she would. Now there was only one final piece of business left to handle. I turned my attention back to Thomas and Linda, preparing to deliver the final boundary that would sever our ties forever. I watched the blood drain entirely from Howard's face as Harrison finished reading the default status of the commercial loan. The arrogant tyrant who had spent 5 years treating me like a disposable subordinate was now struggling just to draw breath. He looked frantically at his lawyer, silently begging for some sort of legal loophole, some magical escape hatch that would save his sprawling suburban mansion from the bank's aggressive foreclosure team. Harrison had nothing to offer him. The lawyer sat back in his expensive leather chair, looking physically ill. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the massive mahogany table. The room was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents above us. I told Howard that he was incredibly lucky. I explained that banks typically do not like holding on to toxic defaulted assets for very long. They prefer to cut their losses quickly and aggressively. I said that just last month the bank was preparing to execute the final foreclosure protocols, which would have resulted in his immediate public eviction from the property he prized so highly. Susan gasped, clutching her pearl necklace tighter. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and utter confusion. She demanded to know what I meant by lucky. She asked how any of this catastrophic financial news could possibly be considered good luck for their family. I smiled. It was a cold, detached smile that sent a visible shiver down Derek's spine. I turned my attention fully to Susan. I told my mother-in-law that Howard was lucky because a private equity firm swooped in at the very last second. I explained that this private equity firm specialized in acquiring distressed commercial assets. They approached the bank directly and offered to purchase Howard's entire defaulted debt portfolio at a significant discount. The bank, desperate to clear the toxic loan off their ledgers, agreed to the sale almost immediately. I told the room that this private equity firm had quietly and legally assumed total ownership of the debt. They had bought the loan out from under Howard entirely. The bank was no longer the primary creditor. The private equity firm was now the entity holding the literal keys to Howard's entire existence. Howard let out a shaky, ragged breath. He tried to puff out his chest, grasping desperately at the last remaining shreds of his authority. He told me that this was none of my business. He said that he would simply negotiate a new payment plan with this private equity firm. He arrogantly proclaimed that these firms were always willing to make a deal if the price was right, and he was more than capable of handling sophisticated corporate negotiations without the input of his hysterical daughter-in-law. I slowly reached into the back pocket of my black leather portfolio. The soft sound of sliding paper echoed loudly in the tense silence of the conference room. I pulled out a single thick document bound by a heavy legal seal. It was the most important piece of paper I had ever held in my hands. I placed it perfectly in the center of the table, right next to the evidence of Derek's federal wire fraud. I looked Howard dead in the eye and delivered the absolute ultimate reveal. I told him he was not going to be negotiating with a faceless corporate entity. I said he was not going to be making any deals or setting up any payment plans. I pushed the document slightly forward, ensuring it was directly under the harsh glare of the overhead lighting. I told him to look closely at the signature on the deed transfer and the primary lien assignment. I announced to the room with absolute unwavering certainty that I was the sole proprietor and chief executive officer of that private equity firm. I told them that I had utilized the massive accumulated corporate consulting bonuses sitting safely in my shielded business accounts to execute the purchase. I had bought Howard's toxic debt. I owned the loan. I owned the lien. Howard stared at the document, his eyes tracking the bold black text that listed my name as the primary controlling authority. He looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. His mouth opened and closed, but he could not force a single word past the sheer horror paralyzing his throat. I did not stop there. I kept my voice perfectly level, driving the final nails into his coffin with surgical precision. I told Howard that he did not own the roof over my head. I said he did not own the roof over his own head. I pointed directly at the legal seal on the document and stated unequivocally that I owned the house. I owned the sprawling suburban mansion he used to intimidate his country club peers. I owned the property he had tried to use as leverage to force me into submission. Susan let out a strangled sob, burying her face in her hands. The reality of her impending social and financial annihilation had finally shattered her performative facade. She realized that her entire identity, built on wealth and status, had just been completely obliterated by the woman she had spent 5 days smearing on Facebook. I turned my gaze back to Howard, who was currently clutching the edge of the mahogany table, trying to keep himself from collapsing out of his chair. I told him that the absolute worst part of his situation was not losing the house. I explained that, because he was so incredibly desperate for that initial commercial loan, he had foolishly tied all of his primary business assets to the property deed as cross-collateral. I leaned closer, dropping my voice to a terrifyingly calm whisper. I told Howard that, because he defaulted on the loan, and because I now held the primary lien, I did not just own his house. I announced that I now held the controlling lien on his entire regional distribution company. I owned his warehouses. I owned his transport fleet. I owned his inventory. I owned everything he had ever built. I owned his entire legacy. The power dynamic in the room did not just shift. It violently, completely imploded. The arrogant patriarchal tyrant who had spent 5 years treating me like a disposable subordinate was now sitting across from me, realizing that I possessed the absolute legal authority to liquidate his entire existence with a single phone call. Derek, who had been practically silent since I walked into the room, suddenly surged forward. He reached across the table, his hands shaking violently, pleading with me to stop. He begged me to tell him this was all just a massive misunderstanding. He claimed that we were a family and that families do not destroy each other over money. He tried to grab my hand, but I pulled it back sharply, refusing to let him touch me. I looked at my husband, feeling absolutely nothing but profound disgust. I told Derek that he lost the right to use the word family the exact moment he locked his infant son out of his home in a dangerous heatwave. I reminded him that just 4 days ago he had smugly informed me that I had absolutely nothing without them. I told him that he was wrong. I said I had everything, and they were the ones who were about to have absolutely nothing. Harrison, the expensive corporate lawyer, slowly reached out and pulled the deed transfer document toward him. He read through the dense legal text, his face growing paler by the second. He looked up at Howard, his professional demeanor entirely gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. He leaned in and whispered frantically to his client, confirming that every single word I had just said was legally accurate and completely undeniable. The lawyer told Howard in a strained, hushed voice that they were in severe, unrecoverable legal and financial jeopardy. He explained that I had established a perfect airtight trap. If they tried to fight the lien, I would immediately press federal charges for the corporate embezzlement Derek had committed. If they tried to negotiate, I held absolute total leverage over every single asset they possessed. Harrison looked at me, then back to Howard, and delivered his final brutal assessment. He told his client that the war was over and they had lost everything. Howard slumped back in his chair, his eyes glazed and unseeing. The realization that his empire was gone, that his son was facing federal prison, and that his wife was sobbing uncontrollably next to him, finally broke him completely. He did not yell. He did not threaten me. He simply stared blankly at the mahogany table, a defeated, broken man. I sat back in my chair, feeling the cool, smooth leather against my back. I looked at the 3 people who had tried to systematically destroy my life to protect their fragile egos. I did not feel triumphant or joyous. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of finality. The toxic cycle of control, manipulation, and abuse was permanently severed. I had walked into their territorial stronghold completely outnumbered, and I had executed a flawless, total victory. They had built a cage for me, but they had actually locked themselves inside and handed me the only key. The ambush was over, the empire was mine, and the next phase of my life was about to begin on my own absolute terms. I waited until the last of my corporate team had packed up their briefcases and exited the boardroom. Nora was the final one to leave, giving me a respectful nod before pulling the heavy oak doors shut behind her. The sharp click of the latch echoed like a final gavel strike. We were completely alone. The vast empty space of the executive suite suddenly felt cavernous, magnifying the ragged, uneven breathing coming from the far end of the marble table. My parents remained planted in their seats, utterly paralyzed by the fallout of Chelsea's violent exit. The golden child, the entire focus of their universe for 33 years, had just looked them in the eye and told them they were dead to her. She had taken their life savings, driven them into foreclosure, and then blamed them for not giving her more to steal. The psychological whiplash had left them entirely hollowed out. Linda was the first to break the silence. A low, wretched sob tore its way out of her throat. It was not the delicate, performative crying she used to manipulate country club acquaintances or garner sympathy at family gatherings. This was an ugly, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated grief. Her shoulders shook violently beneath her ruined designer coat. She pressed her hands against her face, trying to hold back the flood of tears, but the dam had completely burst. "Reese," she gasped, her voice trembling so hard the syllables barely strung together. "Reese, I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry." I did not move. I stood at the head of the table, my hands resting lightly on the cool marble, watching her unravel. "We were so blind," Linda wept, lowering her hands to reveal her streaked, ruined makeup and red, swollen eyes. "We gave her absolutely everything. We handed her our entire lives on a silver platter, and she did not care. She never cared about us. She only cared about what we could buy for her. We threw you away for someone who views us as a bank account." Thomas lifted his head. The arrogant, commanding patriarch of my childhood was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified, broken old man facing the absolute destruction of his legacy. He looked at me with a desperation that was almost painful to witness. "Your mother is right," Thomas said, his voice cracking under the weight of his own humiliation. "We made a catastrophic mistake. We were so obsessed with the image of perfection that we completely ignored the reality right in front of us. We pushed you away because you refused to play the game, and we punished you for your independence. We were fools, Reese, complete and absolute fools." Complete. I listened to their apologies, analyzing the tone and the delivery. For 10 years, I had dreamed of this exact moment. During those freezing nights in my studio apartment, surviving on instant coffee and sheer spite, I had imagined my parents crawling back to me, weeping and begging for forgiveness. I had imagined the fiery, explosive rage I would unleash upon them. I had imagined screaming until my throat was raw, detailing every single ounce of pain they had inflicted upon me. But as I stood there watching them cry, I felt absolutely no anger. The fiery rage that had fueled my empire for a decade was completely gone. In its place was a profound, absolute, and chilling detachment. I felt no urge to comfort them, but I also felt no urge to punish them further. They had already done the worst possible damage to themselves. I was simply observing two strangers mourning the consequences of their own terrible choices. "Please, Reese," Linda begged, leaning forward across the table, her hands clasped together in a posture of desperate prayer. "You have to forgive us. We know we do not deserve it. We know we abandoned you in the most horrific way possible, but we are begging you to let us make it right. We want to be your parents again. We want to know you. We want to know the incredible woman you have become." "You want to know the CEO of Apex Horizon?" I corrected quietly, my voice devoid of any malice or heat. "You do not want to know Reese. You want to know the woman who holds the key to your financial salvation." Thomas flinched as if I had struck him, but the desperation in his eyes quickly overpowered his shame. He stood up from his chair, his legs shaking, and took a hesitant step toward my end of the table. "We are going to lose everything, Reese," my father pleaded, his voice dropping to a frantic, urgent whisper. "The bank is initiating foreclosure proceedings on Monday morning. We have no savings left. We have no retirement accounts. Chelsea drained every single liquid asset we possessed. We are going to be thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing." He stopped a few feet away from me, tears welling in his own eyes. "I know we have no right to ask you for anything. I know we forfeited our right to call ourselves your parents 10 years ago. But we are begging you for mercy. We do not want a $4 million corporate buyout. We do not want you to acquire that fraudulent company. We just need a personal loan." Linda nodded vigorously, wiping her face with the back of her trembling hand. "Just enough to clear the secondary mortgage," she added, her voice thick with panic. "Just enough to stop the bank from taking the house. You have so much, Reese. We saw the numbers your partner presented. A few $100,000 would not even make a dent in your personal wealth, but it would save our lives. We will sign any contract you want. We will pay you back every single month for the rest of our lives. We will do anything." They stared at me, their faces contorted with a pathetic, agonizing hope. They were entirely stripped of their pride. The wealthy, status-obsessed couple who had looked down on me my entire life were now reduced to begging their discarded scapegoat for a financial lifeline. They were clinging to the desperate belief that because we shared the same blood, I would not actually let them sink. They believed that deep down, I still craved their love enough to buy it. I looked at my mother, whose eyes were wide and pleading. I looked at my father, who was standing before me like a condemned man awaiting a pardon. I searched my own heart, looking for even a tiny fraction of guilt or obligation. There was nothing. The well was completely dry. I slowly reached down and picked up my leather tablet. I straightened my charcoal suit jacket, my movements calm, measured, and entirely unbothered. The storm of their panic washed over me without leaving a single drop of moisture. I had reached the absolute end of my journey with them. I had the truth, I had the closure, and I had my peace. "You want me to save you?" I said, my voice echoing clearly in the silent, massive room. "You want me to reach into the empire I built with my own two hands, an empire I built while I was completely alone, and hand you the money you need to erase the consequences of your own actions? You want me to rescue you from the disaster you happily funded?" "Reese, please," Thomas whispered, a single tear escaping and rolling down his weathered cheek. "We are your family." I shook my head slowly, feeling a profound sense of finality settle over my spirit. "No, Thomas. We share genetic material. That is the absolute extent of our connection. You ceased being my family the moment you walked out of that steakhouse and left me sitting alone with a melted cake and a bill I could not afford." I walked around the edge of the marble table, closing the distance between us, until I was standing directly in front of my father. He looked at me, his breath hitching in his chest, waiting for my final verdict. My mother held her breath, her hands still clasped together in desperate prayer. I looked them directly in the eye, maintaining an unwavering, unbreakable gaze. I channeled the exact tone my father had used 10 years ago, cold, dismissive, and utterly devoid of empathy. "Figure it out," I said, my voice cutting through the air with absolute devastating precision. "And stop making Chelsea problems about you." The words struck them with the force of a physical blow. Thomas stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of his leather chair. Linda let out a sharp, devastated wail, burying her face back into her hands as the finality of my statement crushed the very last ounce of hope out of her body. They recognized the words instantly. The horrific, poetic justice of having their own callous abandonment weaponized and handed right back to them paralyzed their vocal cords. They had absolutely no defense. They had no counter-argument. The sheer weight of their own cruelty had finally come back to bury them. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on them and walked purposefully toward the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. My posture was perfectly straight, my steps steady and unhurried. I did not look back over my shoulder. I did not need to see their tears or watch them drown in the wreckage of their own making. I had delivered the final word, and the ledger was permanently balanced. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped out into the brightly lit executive hallway. The air outside the boardroom felt immediately lighter, cleaner, and completely free of the toxic gravity that had weighed me down for a decade. The execution was over. The boundary was set in stone. I was finally truly free. The executive hallway of the Oakwood Country Club was dead silent as I walked away. Behind those heavy oak doors, the wailing of my mother and the stunned, broken silence of my father were instantly cut off, sealed away in a tomb of their own construction. I did not break my stride. I did not pause at the elevator bank or turn around to offer one last glance of pity. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried in my chest for 10 long years, the lingering question of whether I was truly the problem, the phantom guilt instilled by a lifetime of emotional manipulation completely evaporated. I stepped into the glass elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and watched the polished mahogany floors descend out of view. When I walked through the main lobby, the pristine atmosphere of the country club remained entirely undisturbed. The wealthy patrons sipped their mimosas and discussed their golf handicaps, blissfully unaware of the total financial annihilation that had just occurred 3 floors above them. I walked out the front doors and into the crisp, cool autumn air. My private car was waiting by the curb. My driver opened the door, and as I slid into the quiet leather interior, I felt a profound, absolute sense of liberation. I had faced the monsters of my past, stripped them of their power, and walked away without a single scratch. The boundary was not just drawn, it was cast in iron. I leaned my head against the cool leather seat as the car pulled away from the manicured lawns of the estate. For the first time in my life, my mind was entirely quiet. There was no anxiety about how to earn their love, no strategizing about how to prove my worth, and no lingering anger about the profound unfairness of my childhood. I had handed them the exact amount of grace they had shown me on my 23rd birthday. I had given them the unvarnished truth, and I had left them to choke on it. 3 months later, the natural consequences of their delusion played out with the precise, predictable math of a collapsing Ponzi scheme. I did not seek out the information, but in the corporate finance world, the spectacular implosion of a heavily leveraged lifestyle brand makes the morning newsletters. My lead financial auditor, David, included a brief, factual summary of the fallout in my weekly market briefing. It was presented without commentary, just raw data detailing the end of Chelsea's fraudulent empire. Serenity Now was forcibly liquidated. When Apex Horizon officially denied the acquisition and flagged the financial irregularities, the aggressive logistics vendors and unpaid suppliers immediately filed breach of contract lawsuits. The corporate veil was pierced almost instantly. The bank froze the company operating accounts, halting all outgoing wire transfers. Without fresh capital to siphon from our parents, Chelsea could not maintain the facade. The Internal Revenue Service initiated a devastating audit, uncovering the blatant misuse of corporate funds for luxury personal expenses. The inventory sitting in the warehouses was seized and auctioned off for pennies on the dollar to satisfy the secured creditors. Chelsea was forced to declare personal and corporate bankruptcy, her reputation entirely obliterated in the business sector. The influencer friends who had gladly accepted free private flights and ski vacations completely abandoned her the second the money dried up and the federal inquiries began. She had spent a decade treating people as disposable stepping stones, and when she finally stumbled, there was absolutely no one left to catch her. But the absolute harshest reality fell upon my parents. The bank did not care about their country club status or their carefully curated social image. The bank only cared about the missed payments on the secondary mortgage. Thomas and Linda had leveraged their entire existence on a fraudulent dream, and the bill had finally come due. The foreclosure on their primary retirement residence was swift and brutal. The sprawling, beautifully manicured property where they had hosted so many arrogant dinner parties was seized. They were forced to liquidate what few minor assets they had left, just to avoid total destitution. They sold their cars, my mother designer jewelry, and the last of my father, luxury watches. The Oakwood Country Club revoked their membership due to unpaid dues, locking them out of the only social circle they had ever valued. The wealthy friends they had desperately tried to impress instantly ostracized them, treating their financial ruin like a contagious disease. With no savings, no retirement accounts, and absolutely no support from the daughter, they had sacrificed everything to protect Thomas, and Linda were forced to downsize into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. The reality of their new life was a harsh, unforgiving landscape of budget groceries, public transportation, and a tiny living space filled with the suffocating presence of their own monumental regrets. I could only imagine the bitter arguments that echoed off the thin walls of that apartment as the stress of poverty tore their marriage apart. The most poetic justice of all was the complete deterioration of their relationship with Chelsea. According to the bankruptcy filings, Chelsea had attempted to throw our parents under the bus, claiming they were the ones who mismanaged the funds. When that failed, she packed up whatever designer bags she had managed to hide from the liquidators and moved across the country, cutting all contact with Thomas and Linda. She abandoned them in their darkest hour, leaving them to rot in the financial prison they had built for themselves. They had thrown me away to protect her, and she had thrown them away the moment they were no longer financially useful. I sat in my corner office at Apex Horizon reading the final paragraph of David briefing. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, a light winter snow was beginning to fall over the city skyline. The white flakes swirled in the wind, dusting the tops of the skyscrapers. Inside my office, it was warm, quiet, and perfectly secure. I set the tablet down on my pristine desk. I felt no lingering bitterness, no residual anger, and no triumphant gloating. The urge for revenge had completely dissolved, replaced by a deep, unwavering peace. True revenge, I realized, was never about actively destroying them. It was never about screaming matches, or physical retaliation, or trying to force them to feel guilty. True revenge was simply removing my safety net from beneath their toxic tightrope walk. It was stepping aside and allowing gravity to do its job. I had merely let them face the natural consequences of the choices they had been making for decades. A soft knock on the glass door pulled me from my thoughts. Nora walked in carrying a silver tray with 2 cups of fresh, perfectly brewed coffee. David followed closely behind her, holding a new stack of acquisition files for the upcoming quarter. "Good morning, Madam CEO," Nora said with a warm, genuine smile. She set my coffee down on the desk. "The legal team has finalized the contracts for the new logistics startup in Seattle. They are ready for your signature whenever you have a moment. And the analytics department just uncovered a highly undervalued tech firm in Austin." David added, his eyes bright with professional excitement. "We think it could be a massive portfolio booster. The founders are brilliant, but they need exactly the kind of structural guidance Apex Horizon provides." I looked at Nora and David. I looked at the dedicated, brilliant, and fiercely loyal team I had assembled over the past decade. We did not share genetic material. We did not have a shared childhood history. But they were my true family. We were bound by mutual respect, shared ambition, and absolute unwavering integrity. They did not look at me and see an invisible, disappointing scapegoat. They looked at me and saw a visionary, a leader, and a woman who had built an empire from the ground up. "Thank you, Nora," I said, taking a sip of the warm coffee. "Let us get the Seattle contract signed before lunch." And David assembled the senior partners for a preliminary review of the Austin firm at 2:00. "I want to see those numbers today." They nodded, turning to head back out to the bustling, productive executive floor. Their steps were light and purposeful, a stark contrast to the heavy, panicked footsteps of my family 3 months prior. I turned my heavy leather chair back toward the massive windows and looked out over the sprawling city below. 10 years ago, I had walked out of a steakhouse with nothing but $14 and a broken heart. I had been terrified, isolated, and entirely convinced that I was inherently unlovable. I had believed the lies my parents told me about my own worth. Now I sat at the pinnacle of my industry, surrounded by people who valued me, living a life I had carved out of pure determination. My parents and my sister were trapped in a miserable, cramped apartment, suffocating under the weight of their own deceit and entitlement. But I was not trapped anymore. I was completely, beautifully free. I did not need them to apologize. I did not need them to understand my worth or beg for my forgiveness. I had figured it out all on my own. I had built a fortress that their toxicity could never penetrate again. And the view from the top of the empire I built on my own terms was absolutely breathtaking. For years, I was conditioned to believe that my worth was tied to my parents' approval. Like many who grow up as the family scapegoat, I accepted the bare minimum, swallowing my pride to keep the peace, while they poured all their resources and love into an illusion. But the moment I was left sitting alone at that steakhouse with a $50 bill and a melted birthday cake, that illusion finally shattered. The hardest yet most liberating lesson I learned is that sharing DNA does not give anyone the right to manipulate, exploit, or belittle you. True family is built on mutual respect, consistency, and showing up when it matters most. When the people who are supposed to protect you become the ones you need protection from, walking away is not a failure, It is the beginning of your real life. You do not need to seek revenge or waste your energy trying to destroy those who hurt you. The most devastating response you can offer is your own undeniable success. When you remove yourself as their emotional and financial safety net, gravity will eventually do its job. They will be forced to face the natural consequences of their own choices, and you will be free to build an empire on a foundation of your own making. Your value is never determined by those who are too blind to see it. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace, I want you to know that you are not alone. Share your own stories of boundary setting and triumph in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your power and building a life on your own terms. Remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply a life well lived.